You know exactly what you should be doing right now. And you're not doing it, not because you don't care, not because you're lazy, not because you lack willpower. Your brain is doing something far more sophisticated than that, and understanding it changes everything about how you deal with procrastination, forever. For most of human history, procrastination was considered a character flaw, a sign of laziness, a failure of discipline, a moral weakness that could be fixed with more effort, better planning, or stronger willpower. This diagnosis was wrong. And it was wrong in a way that made procrastination significantly worse for almost everyone who struggled with it. Research by Tim Seikel at Carleton University and Fushia Sirowa at Durham University has consistently shown that procrastination is an emotion regulation failure, not a time management or effort problem. This distinction matters enormously, because if procrastination is a time management problem, the solution is a better calendar, a more detailed to-do list, a stricter schedule. And if that approach has never worked for you, you've probably concluded that the problem is you, that you're somehow defective, undisciplined, not trying hard enough. But if procrastination is an emotion regulation problem, the solution looks completely different. It involves understanding what emotions the avoided task is triggering and why your brain has decided that escaping those emotions is more urgent than anything else. Dr. Tim Seikel, a psychology professor at Carleton University and leading researcher in procrastination studies, identifies procrastination primarily as an emotion-focused coping strategy. This means that people tend to delay tasks as a means of temporarily escaping feelings of anxiety, boredom, frustration, or self-doubt associated with confronting challenging or undesirable activities. ResearchGate. You don't scroll your phone because you're bad at planning. You scroll because your brain needs to escape discomfort right now. Every time you face a task you've been avoiding, two regions of your brain enter into conflict. The first is the amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure deep in the brain that functions as an emotional alarm system. The amygdala's primary job is to detect threats and generate rapid responses to eliminate them. It doesn't distinguish between physical danger and psychological discomfort. To the amygdala, the anxiety of starting a difficult project feels just as threatening as a predator in the wild. Procrastination initially feels good because it activates the brain's reward system through dopamine release. When you avoid a challenging or unpleasant task in favor of something more enjoyable, the brain experiences a short-term reward by reducing stress or discomfort in the moment. This temporary relief stems from the limbic system, the brain's emotional center, which prioritizes avoiding pain and seeking pleasure. Clinical trials. The second region is the prefrontal cortex, located just behind the forehead, the most recently evolved part of the human brain, responsible for planning, impulse control, long-term thinking, and rational decision-making. Neuroimaging studies have demonstrated that the prefrontal cortex in the brain is responsible for executive functions, including decision-making and impulse control. The limbic system is responsible for processing emotions, such as pleasure or discomfort, as well as emotional impulses. When rational decisions cannot overpower the limbic system, individuals cannot refrain from the choices that are psychologically desirable, even if those choices carry negative long-term consequences. Woodbury therapists. This is the neural architecture of procrastination, a battle between the prefrontal cortex, which knows what you should do, and the limbic system, which insists on how you feel right now. And in the short term, the limbic system wins almost every time, not because you're weak, because it's older, faster, and evolutionarily more powerful than the part of your brain that makes long-term plans. There's a concept in behavioral economics and psychology that explains one of the deepest mechanisms behind procrastination. It's called temporal discounting. A fascinating concept tied to procrastination is temporal discounting, which explains why people tend to devalue rewards or consequences that are far in the future. Research using fMRI scans has shown that the prefrontal cortex is activated when people make decisions involving delayed rewards. However, when immediate rewards are involved, the limbic system dominates. This imbalance in activation often leads to procrastination. Clinical trials. In practical terms, the satisfaction of finishing a project that's due in 3 weeks feels psychologically much less real than the immediate pleasure of watching one more episode of your favorite show. Not because you don't rationally know the project matters, but because your brain literally discounts the value of anything that isn't happening right now. Experiments involving presenting images of one's own face aged or interacting with a future version of oneself in a VR space have shown an increase in emotional similarity and closeness to the future self, which directly led to improvements in long-term saving behavior and ethical decision-making. Exercises such as writing a letter to oneself 20 years in the future have the effect of increasing the vividness of the future self and mitigating temporal discounting. ResearchGate. This is a finding with profound practical implications. The reason we procrastinate is partly because our future self feels like a stranger, a different person who will deal with the consequences. And we have limited empathy for strangers. One of the most effective psychological interventions for procrastination, therefore, isn't forcing yourself to care about the deadline. It's making your future self more emotionally real to you right now. Here's what makes procrastination so persistent and so difficult to break. Ironically, the temporary relief provided by procrastination ultimately leads to heightened stress and poorer emotional well-being in the long run, creating a vicious cycle of avoidance and anxiety. ResearchGate. The loop works like this. A task triggers negative emotions, anxiety, self-doubt, boredom, resentment. You avoid the task to escape those emotions. The avoidance provides immediate relief, but then guilt and self-criticism arrive. Those feelings generate more negative emotion, which makes the task feel even more threatening the next time you approach it, which makes avoidance even more tempting. Fusquia-Sirois found that low self-compassion explained the stress associated with chronic procrastination, and that self-criticism creates a feedback loop. You procrastinate. You criticize yourself. The criticism generates more negative emotion, and the negative emotion triggers more avoidance. This is why the most common response to procrastination, telling yourself you're lazy, weak, or hopeless, is not only unhelpful, but actively counterproductive. It adds emotional fuel to the exact mechanism you're trying to escape. The harder you judge yourself for procrastinating, the more you procrastinate. Before we get to the solutions, there's a story worth telling. In 1830, the French novelist Victor Hugo was supposed to deliver a manuscript to his publisher. The deadline was set, the contract was signed, and Hugo had written almost nothing. His solution was radical. He gathered every item of clothing he owned and gave them all to his assistant, with strict instructions not to return them for 6 months. With nothing to wear, he couldn't leave his house. And with nothing to do in his house, he wrote. The novel he finished in those 6 months was The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Hugo understood something about procrastination that modern neuroscience has since confirmed. The problem was never motivation. It was the availability of escape routes. When escape became impossible, the task became the only option. This is an extreme solution, obviously, but it illustrates a principle that behavioral psychology has validated extensively. The most effective way to deal with procrastination is not to fight the avoidance urge directly, but to restructure the environment so that avoidance becomes harder than starting. The biggest misconception about procrastination is that it's about time. Piers Steele's 691 correlation meta-analysis, the empirical basis of his temporal motivation theory, found that time management variables explain only a small portion of procrastination variance. So, what does work? The first and most evidence-based intervention is reducing the perceived magnitude of the task. Shrink the task until it no longer triggers the threat response. Write the report becomes open a document and type 3 sentences. The amygdala responds to perceived magnitude, so a smaller version of the task generates a weaker avoidance signal. The amygdala, the emotional alarm system, responds to the size of the perceived threat. A task framed as large, difficult, and important triggers a stronger avoidance response than the same task framed as small and manageable. This is not self-deception. It's working with the architecture of your brain rather than against it. The second intervention is self-compassion. A study by Wohl and Cycle found that students who forgave themselves for procrastinating before one exam procrastinated significantly less before the next one. Self-compassion breaks the cycle not by letting you off the hook, but by reducing the negative emotional fuel that drives avoidance. This is one of the most counterintuitive findings in procrastination research. Being kinder to yourself about your procrastination actually reduces future procrastination. Not because it removes responsibility, but because it removes the shame that makes the task feel more threatening than it already is. When faced with a challenging task, judgmental thoughts may arise, which can cause anger, remorse, and spontaneous task neglect. Mindfulness encourages embracing of these judgmental thoughts, which enables a person to overcome discouragement and continue with the work. The launch pad. The third intervention is implementation intentions, specific if-then plans that bridge the gap between intention and action. Not, I will work on the project this week, but if it is 9 in the morning on Tuesday and I am at my desk, I will open the document and write for 20 minutes. Research consistently shows that specific, concrete plans dramatically increase follow-through compared to vague intentions. Procrastination is not a character flaw. It's a mismatch between the emotional architecture of the human brain and the demands of a world that requires us to do difficult, uncomfortable things now for rewards that arrive later. Every person who has ever procrastinated has experienced the same thing, a brain doing exactly what it was designed to do, prioritizing immediate emotional comfort in a context where that design works against them. Understanding this doesn't make procrastination disappear, but it changes the relationship you have with it. Instead of another round of self-criticism that makes everything worse, you can ask a different question. What emotion is this task triggering, and what's the smallest possible version of it I could start right now? Your brain isn't broken, it's just working with very old software in a very new world, and now, at least, you know how to work with it. Thank you for watching until the end. Subscribe if you want more psychology videos like this, and let me know in the comments, what's the one task you've been putting off the longest, and what emotion do you think it's triggering?